So sometimes I tell people it's like 1,000 cups of coffee, and I tend to be really, really fast and think really, really fast and speak really, really fast. And I think I'm really smart and I think you're really dumb. That's sort of what goes on in my brain, is this sort of very high speed approach to life.
G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today we are talking with Natasha Tracy about her journey with bipolar type 2 disorder. This is our 6th installment in our series on bipolar disorder, meaning we are halfway through our 12-part series. Natasha is a mental health thought leader and an author on the subject of bipolar. She released her bipolar memoir, Lost Marbles, Insights into My Life with Depression and Bipolar, in 2016. And she also runs the podcast, Snap Out of It, the Mental Illness in the Workplace podcast. In this episode, I discuss with Natasha her journey in living with bipolar type 2 disorder. Hello, Natasha, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Let's start off with your book, Lost Marbles, Insight into My Life with Depression and Bipolar. How did the book come to be?
Oh gosh. I think that I decided to write a book after I had produced a blog for a great many years. So I'd been blogging for almost 10 years when I actually wrote the book. And I put together some of the best received work on the blog, and then I added new work to that, and I put it in the form of a book so that I could reach more people. I also really wanted to give people something that they could hold in their hands, a physical representation of all of the information and the tips and the coping techniques that I talked about on my blog. And so that, a book, a physical, tangible thing was something that I really wanted to give to my readers.
And when did you first realize that bipolar was kind of becoming a part of your life? Like, where were you at?
I started having mood disturbances, right? So not necessarily bipolar disorder full blown, but mood disturbances from the time that I was a child. But it wasn't until I was about 19 years old that a mood disturbance, in this case, depression, really took over my life. So in the case of being 19, what I remember was, for example, I would cry all the time for absolutely no reason at all. I would just start crying spontaneously. And I was upset all the time, and I was sad all the time. And I was having real urges to self-harm, among other things. All of this sort of popped out of nowhere. Nothing had happened in my life. There was nothing tragic going on, but this all just started happening, and it wouldn't go away. And so when I was 19, that's when I eventually sought help.
And what was it like growing up with that? Like as a kid, kind of going through school and life? I mean, how does that affect a child kind of going through all that?
As a child, it's interesting because as a child, you don't know any different, right? Everything to a child is normal because the child only has that one child's experience on which to draw. So, for example, something simple that would happen when I was young is I would always bug my mother, of course, to allow a friend to come over and sleep overnight. Nothing unusual about that. And then, of course, when they were there, I would run around like a crazy child and, like my hair was on fire. And I had an amazing time. And I would be hyper the whole time, and I wouldn't sleep, and it would be incredibly fun for me. And I would never want to let them go home. I would always want them to stay forever. And when they did go home, I would crash, and I would crash into a very sad puddle. And I didn't understand why I never wanted them to leave and why it was so bad when they did leave, when no one else seemed to have such a strong reaction to that type of thing. And that, I think, was just part of what was becoming irregular mood shifts for me. In that case, it was happening because of a stimulus. And of course, as I grew older, mood shifts started happening without a stimulus. But as a child, that was just part of what I remember. But of course, I thought it was normal because I was the only one I knew. And so it was very, I guess, that tumult, that emotional tumult, just became something that was expected for me.
And I think that's a really interesting point you mentioned there, like as a child, not realizing that you thought this was kind of normal kind of thing. I mean, like, what was the point where you kind of started to realize there might be something kind of going on here?
Certainly during my teenage years, I was aware that something was really wrong. But there were a lot of things going on in my life that also accompanied my teenage years. There was a divorce with my parents, and there was lots of, concern around that and how I was reacting to that. And there were other things. And of course, being a teenager is a rocky time for many people. So when I would go through really difficult times as a teenager, and I mean really difficult, I was crying in class, and I was self-harming, I was suicidal. I was thinking about suicide from the time I was 13 years old. And even though this was all happening to me, no one ever thought there could be a mental illness at play. Everyone just assumed that it was normal teenage angst, and everyone assumed that it had to do with things going on in my life. And it turned out both of those assumptions were wrong. Yes, I was a normal teenager, and yes, I probably was moody, just as a normal teenager is. But what I was experiencing was an order of magnitude different from that. But no one ever spotted it. I was aware that something was really wrong because I was in so much pain, but I certainly never thought the words mental illness never crossed my mind, because in my family where I grew up, we didn't really believe in mental illness. I was sort of taught that it didn't really exist. I was taught that people with depression just needed to get over themselves, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And I was taught that medication was just for weak people, and it was just a drug that people were using just like any other drug. And so certainly I never thought that I would be a person with a mental illness, because I didn't put myself in that category. And I had many misperceptions about what a mental illness actually was.
And I think it's very important that we kind of just highlight now, like, there seems to be a lot of, and if you're comfortable with sharing with this next question, there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding towards self-harm. I mean, like, why do people do it? Like, what, like, because I think a lot of people who don't kind of have those feelings kind of find it hard to go, well, what's going on here? So, like, yeah, what drives someone to kind of do that?
It is definitely different for different people. So I can tell you that one of the main reasons that I self-harmed is because I hated myself and I thought I deserved it. So when I was a teenager, and the first time it happened, I was 12 or 13 years old. And I remember being very guilt-ridden because of a mistake that I had made. And certainly mistakes were very frowned upon in my family. It was a very perfectionistic family. But more than that, a mistake was seen, in my mind anyway, as being a huge personal flaw. So it wasn't even that there was an isolated mistake. It was that the mistake said that I was a bad person and I didn't deserve what everyone else deserved. And so the kind of pain that I would inflict on myself was because I actually thought that I deserved it. Now, self-harm doesn't have to be about that. It can be about many other things. For example, another way that I used self-harm was when my emotions were so huge and big and I couldn't contain them. My pain was so extreme from depression, for example. I would actually use self-harm as a coping technique to deal with the pain. So the physical pain would actually distract from the mental pain and anguish that I was absolutely in.
And what would be your advice to, like, people that, family or friends of people that are kind of going through these kind of things? Like, how should family and friends, like, approach someone that's kind of going through all these kind of things?
The first thing I think is really important is to not further stigmatize what's going on. So I can tell you that someone who self-harms already feels really bad about it. They know it's not normal. They know it's not healthy. And so don't make them feel worse about it by saying, why do you do that? How could you do that to yourself? And so on. Those are not helpful comments. You want to make sure and try to understand where that person is coming from, and understand that self-harm is a real issue for millions of people. It is not an isolated one-off incident. And there's a reason why millions of people do it. There are many reasons, in fact, why millions of people do it. So if you have a loved one who's struggling, what you want to do is be empathetic and understand that something is very wrong if the person has resulted or has gone and self-harmed as a result of whatever's going on with them. And self-harm is what we call a negative coping technique. So they are coping with something. That's why they're using that self-harm. It's just that it's a negative coping technique in that it's harming them while they're trying to cope with whatever it is that is going on for them. So the best thing that person can do is focus on replacing it with positive coping techniques. Now, for example, when I was 13 or 12 years old, I didn't have necessarily the coping techniques that I needed to deal with the kind of things that were going on in my brain. And that's true for many people. The reason they go to self-harm is because they don't have the right coping techniques. So how you can help a person who's going through that is to help them learn new coping techniques. The best way to do that is most likely through therapy with a psychotherapist, so that that person can help teach them positive, healthy coping techniques that can get them through the times that are really difficult for them.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is author Natasha Tracy, where we are talking about her journey with bipolar.
And did you find that a lot of the time when you're kind of going through these negative thoughts, it was when you're going through a depressive episode with your bipolar, or would it sometimes happen even when you were manic?
So, mania, and in my case, hypomania, because I actually have bipolar disorder type 2, which is actually characterized by a mood called hypomania, which is slightly less severe than mania is. So, when I was hypomanic, I would feel great about myself, about the world. Everything was fabulous. But I also experienced something called a mixed mood episode. And that's where you have elements of hypomania or mania and depression mixed together. So, in an episode like that, you might have the energy from hypomania, which is really, really high, but you might also have the incredibly negative, horrible, destructive thoughts of depression. So, in that way, you're actually experiencing both of those things at the same time. So, negative thoughts are actually really common for me, both in a depressive episode and in a mixed episode.
And I mean, how do you describe that mania feeling? Like, how does it feel to describe it to someone that's never kind of gone through it? Like, yeah, like how's it feel?
That's a really interesting question. So it's almost like speaking a different language, right? So most people have experiences in life that range from a -5 to a +5 on a scale when you look at their mood, right? 0 being somewhere in the middle, something normal, -5 being after the loss of someone dear to them, +5 being when they've gotten a great promotion at work, for example. That's where most of people's experience lies. The thing about bipolar disorder is it takes you above a +5 or below a -5. So when you look at hypomania, it's above a +5. So sometimes I tell people it's like 1,000 cups of coffee, and I tend to be really, really fast and think really, really fast and speak really, really fast. And I think I'm really smart and I think you're really dumb. And that's sort of what goes on in my brain is this sort of very high speed approach to life, very high energy approach to life. And I can sit down and I can write pages and pages, and I could be extremely creative at that time. But in saying that, it doesn't necessarily mean the pages that I've written are good. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the creativity is nearly as brilliant as I think it is. At that moment, I think I'm a brilliant genius. But of course, later, when you come down, you realize, of course, that's not the case. You're just a regular person. And often the thoughts that you have when you're hypomanic are not very rational. So sitting down and writing 20 pages, for example, of things that I might want to say, when you read it later, when you've come down, it may not make a lot of sense because my brain, at the best of times, skips from lily pad to lily pad. So in other words, it tends to make jumps from one place to another quite frequently. But when hypomanic, those jumps start to be over caverns. And so you can't follow a train of thought when it's jumping over a cavern from one side to another. A rational person isn't going to be able to follow that. And so when you're hypomanic, you don't get that you can't be followed. You don't get that you can't be understood because it all makes sense to you, even though it doesn't make sense to anyone else.
And a lot of people that we've kind of had on this on the show, a part of this series, have kind of described this feeling with their manic episodes that they don't want to take on recovery because they like that feeling of being really really feeling really good and really up. I mean, did you ever have that feeling, or was that not so much for you?
So I definitely can understand the appeal of a hypomanic episode. I think that feeling up and not needing to sleep and having all this energy and feeling like you're a brilliant creative person. I mean, who doesn't want to feel like that every single day? But for me, with bipolar disorder type 2, I had many, 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 and continue to have many more depressions than I have hypomanic episodes. And so because depression is so much more prevalent for me than hypomania, it's not even a question. I would treat my bipolar disorder any day to avoid those depressions.
And you were diagnosed at 19. I mean, what was that for you? Like finally getting that diagnosis. I mean, was that a big moment for you?
So initially, I was actually diagnosed with minor depression, and I knew at the time that the guy was wrong. I had done research on what had been going on for me, and I knew that I had bipolar disorder, but the doctor disagreed. And at the time, being a 19-year-old person who was really taught to respect authority, I didn't have it in me to actually stand up to this guy and tell him any different. So when he said to me, "You have minor depression," I just said, "Okay." because I also didn't have any energy because of the huge depression that I was in. There was just nothing inside of me where I could disagree with him. And it wasn't for about 8 months, I guess, until I saw a different psychiatrist. And that psychiatrist was more open to the idea that I had bipolar disorder. And eventually he actually diagnosed me with bipolar disorder. But it did, I guess, take about a year for that to actually all occur. And that's actually very common with bipolar disorder. It tends to take time to diagnose it. It's not easy, especially when it's bipolar disorder type 2, because while the depressions can be very prominent, the hypomanias can be easy to miss. And also, as you were alluding to earlier, people often don't talk about them because they actually like them and don't think anything is wrong. So for me, it was sort of this moment that I almost fought for. I had to almost fight for that diagnosis because it was not the easiest thing to get at the time. I guess I didn't fully comprehend it at that time. I didn't realize that it was going to be a life-altering diagnosis. The psychiatrist told me I would take medication, I would get better, and I would go back to my pre-mood self. I would go back to my regular self. And this isn't accurate for most people with bipolar disorder. Many, many people with bipolar disorder have a chronic illness state where they go from different states of illness, some being better, some being worse, but it's a very chronic condition that has to be managed on a daily basis, which is what mine is. And I certainly never went back to a pre-bipolar self at any time, no matter what medications I was on. And so I think that the doctors they certainly misled me. And I think that they mislead a lot of people so as to not scare people off. But I don't do that. I try to tell people the truth, even when it's really uncomfortable and even when it's, unvarnished and dirty.
Yeah, and I think that great points there. I mean, you mentioned that initial misdiagnosis. I mean, how well is the medical field then kind of approaching bipolar? Are they getting it right? Do they have some work to do, or like, what do you think? Like, yeah.
So I think that it really depends on who you're seeing in terms of how much work they have to do. So for example, most people start their diagnostic journey by seeing their family doctor. And a family doctor is less likely to diagnose you with bipolar disorder because they are less likely to truly understand what bipolar disorder looks like. Family doctors are generalists. They understand a lot of things, a little tiny bit about a lot of things, which means they don't have in-depth knowledge about something like bipolar disorder. They are more versed at seeing depression. So they are much more likely to actually diagnose you with depression, whether you have that or whether you have bipolar disorder. Now, on the other hand, if you see a psychiatrist, they are more likely to accurately diagnose you. But even they get it wrong quite a bit of the time. And that's because bipolar disorder type 1, which we think of as classic bipolar disorder with the extreme manias and the extreme depressions, that one's easy to spot. You can spot it from a kilometer away. But when you talk about bipolar disorder type 2 with the hypomanias, which are less severe, that's actually much harder to spot and can take years to actually get to the point where a doctor realizes that they've been mismedicating you and misdiagnosing you, and that actually you do have some hypomanias there that you never discussed or that they never inquired about or whatever. And I think they do have a lot of work to do. I think that they're all doing the best that they can with the resources that they can, but bipolar disorder is difficult and slippery. And so it's hard for people to get that correct diagnosis.
It also sounds like from what you kind of were saying before, that bipolar disorder is something also that's kind of more managed than recovered from. Is that kind of is that how you would frame it, kind of thing?
I definitely would frame it that way for most people, for sure.
And do you think it's also, I mean, some people have highlighted too that it's on the shows that it's very hard with, you have to, like with medications, that it's different for everyone, like getting that balance right. I mean, what do you reckon about that?
In my experience, and I talk to people with bipolar disorder every day, that's all I do. In my experience, the cornerstone of anyone starting to recover, getting to a place of, wholeness and balance, that cornerstone is medication for people. And so yes, people with bipolar disorder absolutely need medication. However, people with bipolar disorder, as you were saying, all need different medication. And so it's very difficult to know what medication to put a person on initially. And then if that one fails, what should the second choice be? Now, obviously, we have evidence. We know that certain medications are good to use in the first line and second line treatments. But in the end, it starts to feel like you're a guinea pig as a person with bipolar disorder because they just throw medication at you and they don't know if it's going to work. And you have to take it possibly for months before you can figure out, oh my gosh, this isn't working. I have to taper off of it and then taper onto something else. And you can go through that for literally years before you find the medication that works for you. Now, in my particular case, it took 2 years to find a medication that started to bring about any sense of balance for me. And I didn't think I was going to survive those 2 years. I mean, that's the honest to goodness truth. I thought that I gave myself a year when I initially started the treatment. And I said, if I don't get better after a year, I'm going to kill myself. That's what I did. But after a year, I definitely wasn't better. And I was seeing a therapist, and I told him that I had promised to kill myself because this wasn't working. And basically, he and I worked together to avoid that outcome, obviously. And it took another year after that to actually find, a magic bullet medication for me. But the other thing that's really difficult about medication with bipolar disorder is that it stops working spontaneously for people. People the brain grows accustomed to it, and then it stops working. And then you have to start again, and you have to start looking for medication again. You may have to add a second medication or a third medication, or even more to find some semblance of balance in your life. And then those medications might stop working. So it's a constant cycle of where are you today? How are things for you today? And what kind of treatment do you need today?
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is author Natasha Tracy, where we are talking about her journey with bipolar.
I mean, that's an interesting point too. I mean, like the medications and they just stop working. I mean, do you know like why that would be? Like, is there like some like reason why, or is it just happens?
Well, it's basically the concept of tolerance. So we all have tolerance to medication and drugs. For example, if you look at a street drug, we're all familiar with the concept that at first you take a small amount and you get high, and then but then it takes a little bit more to give you the same high. And then it takes you a little bit more to give the same high. And eventually, someone who is addicted to a substance, they're taking huge amounts of a medication, of a drug that would literally kill anyone else. But they have so much tolerance built up that that's what they need in order to get high, or indeed even to feel quote unquote normal for themselves. And this is basically the same concept. Your brain eventually develops tolerance to the medication. Now, why does it develop tolerance, and why does it develop tolerance at any given moment? Those are the questions that we're still looking for answers for.
And when you did reach that kind of stability, I mean, like, what was that like for you? Like going through that journey, like that 2 years where you're kind of trying to find that stability. I mean, when you finally got there, like that must have been a great moment for you.
It's really interesting, actually, because initially I didn't know that I was getting better. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but the thing about it is for me, it was a very slow process. So I didn't wake up one day and suddenly feel better. That's not what happened for me. What ended up happening for me was a very, very slow rise from the depression that I was in. And so I would start smiling a little bit. And I didn't notice that necessarily, but the smiles were actually genuine as opposed to something I painted on my face to show everyone. And so I would then smile a little bit more. And then I started to find joy from things. And it wasn't actually until I was walking through the student union building of my university, and it was clubs day that day, and the skydiving club was there. And I had always wanted to do a skydive. And so I walked over to the table where they were signing people up for it. And the guy behind the table says, "Don't you have any questions?" And I said, "Do I get to jump out of a plane?" "Yes," he said. I said, That's all I need to know. And I literally signed up on the spot for a skydive. And it wasn't until that moment that I realized, oh my gosh, something is different for me. I feel different.
I could imagine that, like, in daily life too. I mean, someone kind of going through that, reaching that stability. I mean, I can imagine that relationships with friends and family would get better. Like, you'd have more joy with people. I mean, is that kind of what you found?
It's absolutely true. I mean, when you're in a place where you're unstable or you're in a massive depression, for example, you're in this giant hole, the relationships that you have with people are so almost infected by the illness that it's impossible for that not to change the relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean your relationship will end, but it does mean that there is a change there because you're so sick. It's like any other illness. You know, if a person got cancer, you wouldn't expect their relationships to stay the same. Well, if you're really unstable with bipolar disorder, the relationships absolutely are different. And then when you finally reach a place where you have a bit of balance, where you've climbed out of a depression, that sort of thing, you can see people for who they are. And you can see yourself for who you are, and you can develop bonds and relationships that are so much better and deeper because you're not worried about your illness all the time.
And brilliant points. I mean, from all we've kind of discussed in this interview, Natasha, I mean, we've highlighted your own story. We've highlighted, some advice for people. I mean, with this question, I want to ask, how can society understand bipolar better?
That's a great one. So I did write this book and I hope that people will read it. And I know that professionals have read it. I've gotten some really amazing feedback from professionals who have said this is the book that you actually want to read to learn about bipolar disorder, not a medical textbook, not something else, but this particular book. But in addition to that, I think that what we need to understand is that bipolar disorder exists in life, yes, but it also exists in the workplace. And so it exists in every area in the educational institutions. Now, when I was at university, I did have to get certain accommodations in order to go through and get my degree because of what was happening to me with my bipolar disorder. And I can say that in my particular experience, the school, the professors, et cetera, were actually quite good about accommodating my particular needs. And at universities, at colleges, they do tend to have groups of people with disabilities that can help you get those accommodations if you need them. But those accommodations don't tend to exist in life or in the workplace, other places where people with bipolar disorder exist. So when I think about society understanding bipolar disorder, it has to be an understanding that bipolar disorder exists everywhere and that anyone can get it. So for example, the person working in the cubicle next to you might actually have bipolar disorder. There's no way for you to know. The parent who lives across the road from you might have bipolar disorder. There's no way for you to know. And those people might need some accommodation in order to help them live their best life, be their best employee, be the best parent that they can be, and so on, because of their bipolar disorder. And so what I think society needs to understand is that those accommodations need to happen. So when someone asks for a little bit of a change because they have a mental illness, it's just like if they had asked for a change because of any other serious illness that they might be suffering. We don't expect people with serious illnesses to do everything exactly the same as everyone else. We understand that that's not very reasonable. So we have to understand that people with bipolar disorder aren't necessarily going to be able to do things the same as everyone else. So accommodations matter. They're really important. And that can happen on a personal level between you and, for example, a friend, you and a neighbor, you and a coworker, or they can come at a professional level where, for example, a person might need more support in the workplace, or a person might need extra support from people like, people who can care for someone's children while they're going through an episode, and so on. These are things that I would like society to understand and to start working with.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today, Natasha, to talk with us. It was a pleasure.
Thank Thanks so much, Jack. I really appreciate you having me today. I really think that this is an important topic, and I'm really glad you're talking about it.
My guest today was Natasha Tracy, author of the bipolar memoir, Lost Marbles, Insights into My Life with Depression and Bipolar. Tune in next week as we continue to talk with those with bipolar, and if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.